Hi, everybody, and welcome. This is Liz Stanton. I'm the Director and Senior Economist at the Applied Economics Clinic, and it is my pleasure today to act as moderator for IEEFA's online session on the financial risks of carbon capture for coal-fired power plants. David Schlissel is our presenter today, and David is IEEFA's Director of Resource Planning Analysis and is part of IEEFA's carbon capture team. IEEFA's reports and analysis on carbon capture are available on the IEEFA website. David also wanted me to let you know that his slides for this presentation will be available on IEEFA's website, and that if you have any lingering questions after the session is over, he'd be very happy to answer those for you on email. Let's talk about the logistics of how this works. In a moment, we'll turn to David's presentation on carbon capture. And after that, we'll return to a question and answer session with me and David. And here's how that will work. You will be writing your questions into SwapCard, and I will take them from there and ask them to David and get answers for you. Here are the specifics on how to do that. So if you have any questions for David, on the right-hand side of the live feed, there's a chat box with 3 tabs. The first tab is a live discussion where you can share your opinions and reactions to the session with other audience members. On the second tab, you'll find a live Q&A, and you use this to ask a question that you want to get an answer to. And if someone else has asked a question that you like, you can click the thumbs up, and that question will be pushed to the top of the list. So I'll be paying attention to that list of questions and seeing what new questions come in and also which ones have lots of thumbs ups. And I'll be passing those questions along to David and we'll hear his answers. So with no further ado, let's get started with David's presentation. Thanks, everybody.
Good afternoon. Welcome to IEEFA's observations on carbon capture at coal-fired power plants. These observations are based on our work over the last 2 to 3 years, analyzing a number of proposed carbon capture retrofits at existing coal plants in the U.S. and reviewing the available literature on carbon capture. I just want to note that when I say our, I mean the work of the 3 of us on the IEEFA carbon capture team. Myself, Dennis Wamstead, and Carl Cates. You can go to the IEEFA website to see some of the work we have produced on carbon capture so far, and there is more in the pipeline that will come out in the coming months. As shown on my slide 2, there are currently 2 operating coal plants that capture some of the CO2 they produce. These are the Boundary Dam Unit 3 coal plant in Saskatchewan, Canada, and Petronova, a project near Houston, Texas. Boundary Dam went into service. Boundary Dam's carbon capture facility went online in October of 2014. Petronova went into service in early 2017. There are 7 or possibly 8, depending on how you counted them, proposed carbon capture projects around the U.S., as you can see from the map on slide 2. Our work has led us to 3 overall conclusions on carbon capture. The first is that capturing CO2 from existing coal plants is uneconomic, and the market in the U.S. for doing so, already limited, is shrinking fast. The second conclusion is that retrofitting existing coal-fired power plants for carbon capture will prolong the operating lives of some units. Instead of capturing CO2 from aging and uneconomic coal plants, the same money would be better spent on developing new renewable resources and on energy efficiency, and thereby not produce the CO2 in the first place. Our third conclusion is that continuing to do research on capturing CO2 from non-coal sources is very important, including capturing the CO2 from gas-fired power plants, industrial sources, as well as direct air capture. Analyzing the financial viability of proposed carbon capture projects involves examining a range of factors, the most important of which are listed on my slide 4. Of these, the four most important are the initial capital or construction cost of the retrofit, how much CO2 will the retrofitted plant produce, how much of the CO2 that it produces will be captured, and 4, what will it cost to generate electricity at the plant after it is retrofitted for carbon capture. The proponents of carbon capture focus on the first 3 of these factors, but ignore the issue of what will be the price of the electricity from the plant after it's retrofitted. Instead, they simply dismiss this as an issue by saying incorrectly and untruthfully that these plants are low-cost generators. In many cases that we've looked at, the answer is they are not. And as I will show later in this presentation, retrofitting for carbon capture is likely to make the cost of electricity from a coal plant much more expensive. Now, looking at slide 5, you can see that the federal government has spent well over $100 million in the past couple of years to support site-specific analyses on what are called front-end engineering design or FEED studies for proposed retrofits. In addition, the 2018 Federal Tax Act provides what could ultimately be many billions of dollars of tax credits for the developers and investors in carbon capture retrofits. For example, the Act provides for a tax credit that are called 45 capital Q credits of $35 for each metric ton of CO2 that is captured from a coal plant and used for what's called enhanced oil recovery, or in shorthand, EOR. And the same act provides for $50 a ton federal tax credit for CO2 that is captured and then permanently stored or sequestered in a secure geologic underground formation. However, our project-specific economic and financial analyses show that even these billions of dollars of subsidies will not be adequate, 1, to cover the full cost of retrofitting coal plants with carbon capture, 2, to protect investors from the full range of risks associated with retrofitting and then operating coal plants after they are retrofitted for carbon capture, and 3, will not protect ratepayers against the risk of having to pay higher electricity rates because of retrofits. Slide 6 shows that there is only a very limited market in the U.S. for carbon capture retrofits, and that market is shrinking rapidly. As you see on the left side of slide 6, the percentage of electricity produced from coal in the U.S. has declined from 50% in 2010 to about 20% in 2020 and is expected to drop to 11% by sometime between 2024 and 2030. At the same time, on the right side of slide 6, you can see that the average coal plant capacity factor has declined substantially over this period. Now, a plant's capacity factor measures how much it actually produces in electricity compared to what it would have produced if it had operated at full power for 100% of the hours in the period. The higher the capacity factor, the more electricity the plant produces. The lower the capacity factor, the lower the amount of electricity it produces. And obviously a higher capacity factor is better for the plant. But as slide 6 shows, that's not been happening, and we expect over the future years that coal plant capacity factors will continue to decline, and that many additional coal plants will be retired as their owners decide that continuing to operate the plants are uneconomic, and also that there are cheaper alternatives, renewables, natural gas in particular. Now, as I noted earlier, one of the major factors affecting the financial viability of a proposed carbon capture retrofit is its capital or construction cost. Proponents of carbon capture claim that the capital cost of retrofitting existing coal plants is going to decline dramatically in coming years. Although it is reasonable to expect that there will be some decline in capital costs over time, and I have to emphasize over time, as more plants are built and operated, lessons will be learned and projects can be expected to grow in size and number. However, the dramatic declines projected by proponents of carbon capture are simply not realistic. The cost of retrofitting them will not decline this sharply or this quickly. If you look at slide 8, you can see on the left how the projected costs of proposed carbon capture retrofits compares to the actual cost that was incurred retrofitting or building the Petra Nova project in Texas. The proponents of new plants some of them project that the cost of a new plant will be 72% less expensive than the actual cost of Petra Nova. We don't expect that to happen. In fact, scaling up new technologies, which is what we're talking about here, almost always leads to unanticipated problems and additional costs, both during construction and operation. If you look at my slide 9, this is especially true for two economically disastrous projects. The Edwardsport, its integrated gasification combined cycle project, IGCC plant in Indiana, and the Kemper IGCC plant in Mississippi. IGCC just refers to the fact that these plants were expected to take coal, gasify it, make it into a gas, take the CO2 out, at least in the Kemper case, and then burn the natural gas. Both of the plants, as you can see from slide 9, the actual costs were dramatically higher than the proponents projected. Same thing has happened with new nuclear plants. The cost of the 2 new nuclear units at the Vogtle plant in Georgia has skyrocketed, and they're not even finished yet. The second major factor in determining the financial viability of a proposed retrofit is how much CO2 will be captured. Capturing 90% of the CO2 produced in a coal plant is the holy grail of carbon capture. Although proponents of carbon capture claim that the technology for 90% capture has been proven or demonstrated at the existing Boundary Dam and Petra Nova projects, the reality is neither one has produced any evidence to support this claim. Indeed, the limited data that is publicly available suggests that neither has achieved the capture of 90% of the CO2 it produces on a consistent basis. In fact, as you look at slide 10, you can see that both projects, Boundary Dam Unit 3 and Petra Nova, have actually captured less CO2 than their owners projected they would when they went into service. Now, we've performed an analysis of Petra Nova based on available public information, and it appears that the project has captured somewhere between 80 and 82% of the CO2, not 90%. And Boundary Dam appears to have captured much less than that. Part of the problem is that the owners, in particular Petra Nova, haven't produced any data to justify their claim that the project is actually capturing 90% of the CO2. The owners also haven't produced any actual data on what it's costing to capture CO2, or whether the project has experienced any unanticipated technical and operating problems since it went into service in early January of 2017. Instead of producing this evidence, they just want everyone to accept that everything has gone great at the project. Now, if it was me and my project, everything went great, I'd be showing off all the data I could to prove it to people. Obviously, they don't think that's necessary, or else it's not true that the plant's operated well. Also, the third factor in affecting the financial viability of project is that retrofitted coal plants are unlikely to produce enough CO2 to make them financially viable. See, first they have to produce the CO2 and then they have to capture as much of it as they can. For example, the two remaining units at the San Juan generating station in northwest New Mexico have achieved only a 70% average capacity factor over the past decade and only an average 63% capacity factor in the past 2 years. As I mentioned, the higher the capacity factor, the better. Now, the proponents of retrofitting San Juan claim that miraculously, once the units are retrofitted for carbon capture, instead of achieving a 63% capacity factor or a 70% capacity factor, they will, as I say, miraculously achieve an average 85% capacity factor every year. But there's no evidence to support this, and it's patently absurd to expect that an older coal plant its performance will increase this much. Actually, you would expect that as coal plants age, their performance will decline. Also, as shown in Figure 12, the reason why having a higher capacity is important is because having a lower capacity means that the plant will produce less CO2, which in turn means it will be eligible for far fewer 45Q federal tax credits. This makes the project far less financially viable and significantly increases the risk for investors. Indeed, we expect that instead of increasing after being retrofitted for carbon capture, San Juan's capacity factors will continue to decline due to the continued availability of low-cost natural gas in the Southwest, increased competition from declining cost renewables, and also increasing integration of the Western U.S. grid. In essence, San Juan will have to compete with ever-increasing amounts of solar power coming out of California in particular. Finally, as shown on slide 13, retrofitting a coal plant for carbon capture will lead to higher, perhaps much higher electricity prices for ratepayers. As you can see on the left side of slide 13, the net output of a coal plant will decline after being retrofitted for carbon capture. That's because the carbon capture equipment requires a substantial amount of the gross output, the total power that's produced by the plant, for operating. This means that while the gross output of the plant, as you can see on the left side of slide 13, remains the same, more of it is consumed by running the internal equipment, including the carbon capture equipment, and less power is available for ratepayers or to be sold into the market. This means that the cost per megawatt hour will go up. Now, on the right side of slide 13, you can see that we have done a hypothetical illustration of what would have happened if San Juan had been retrofitted prior to 2019. In that case, the cost would have increased from the actual average price of $44.90 per megawatt hour to $63.29. Either of these, with or without carbon capture, would have been much higher than the cost of buying power from solar projects. Recent solar power purchase agreements in New Mexico have had prices of $15 per megawatt hour just for solar electricity and $30.37 per megawatt hour for a project that would have solar electricity plus storage capability. Finally, it would have been cheaper in both cases, in actual reality, or if in the hypothetical that the plant had been retrofitted prior to 2019, would have been cheaper to just buy power from the wholesale market at one of the hubs in Arizona. If you have any questions about what I've discussed, please fire away now, or else contact Dennis, Carl, or me after the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Liz Stanton again, and I'm joining you here from beautiful Arlington, Massachusetts. And I have with me David Schlissel, the presenter today, who's coming to us from Belmont, Massachusetts, my neighbor. We're eager to see your questions that you can type into us using the questions tab in the swap card. So over on the right-hand side, click on questions and then type in your question. David, let's get the ball rolling. I certainly had some questions from your talk, and thank you for that. It was very clear, and I'm going to look forward to seeing your slides up on the IEEFA website. My first question was, could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between adding CCS to a coal plant and the expectation regarding its capacity factor? You had mentioned an example where the claim was that adding CCS would somehow raise capacity factors. And I'm just wondering how that's being justified. I don't see the mechanism.
The answer is they haven't justified it. They've just assumed it. The San Juan plant, which is the plant you're talking about, had over the last 2.5 years or so, has had a 63% capacity factor. The proponents of retrofitting the plant for carbon capture assume it's going to be 85% after it's retrofitted. So their assumption is you make the plant more complicated because you're adding more equipment. It's going to be older and it's going to run better. Now, I wish that worked for people, but it doesn't work for either people or power plants.
And you were talking about an example that was vertically integrated, right?
No, it's currently owned by Public Service Company of New Mexico. Mm-hmm. They're retired. They and 3 of the other owners are retiring the plant, and mm-hmm. one of the owners wants to continue it. The city of Farmington wants to take over ownership and then retrofit it.
Yeah, that's a bit puzzling.
Yeah, it's very puzzling. Their whole proposal is full of, if you want to be nice, you say extremely optimistic assumptions. If you want to be honest, you say a lot of assumptions that are misleading or just unrealistic.
Gotcha. Let me ask for a moment, just because I'm new to this tool and I want to get a sense of who's here and participating with us. Can everybody who is on the line please just send a chat? Just say hi. That's all I need, and it's going to let me gauge who we're talking to. That would be appreciated. Thank you. David, let's talk a little bit about what happens to the CO2 that is collected in such a plant. How would it be stored? Are there costs involved? Is there a market for it? What about that end of things?
There are 2 possible destinations for the CO2 that's captured. Actually, 3 possible destinations. One is it leaks into the atmosphere somehow. But the other 2 are it's either sold for use in enhanced oil recovery, which means that you inject it into the ground and it creates more oil, which is then burned. So it kind of undercuts the capturing of the CO2, at least in part. The other possibility is to permanently sequester it underground in a secure geological formation. That's done a number of places around the world.
Right.
But you've got to be sure that you can store it permanently for a long time. Because if it gets burped back into the atmosphere, it could create serious problems, and you've lost any benefit of the whole process.
Right. So this technology could only be appropriate in certain areas where you have the right geological formations underneath?
Yes. Or you could pipe it somewhere. I mean, one of the proposals in the one in the southeast is, I think one of the pipelines would be 200 some odd miles. long.
Okay.
And yes, there are costs associated with capturing it, piping it, and then injecting it into the ground.
Right, of course. Yeah. You just said something about there being some international examples. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, there are currently 21 active carbon capture projects around the world. Only 2 of the 19 are from power plants.
The rest are
industrial uses.
okay. And some of them are large scale, or
they call them large scale. I don't think the numbers, generally, I don't have all the numbers off the tip of my tongue, but power plants would produce and presumably capture a large amount of CO2.
right, exactly. And I'm wondering about how big are these 21 carbon capture facilities that are out there? Or is it 19 plus the US? Whatever the number is.
It's 19 plus the 2 from coal plants. One of the coal plants is in Saskatchewan, Canada, Boundary Dam, and the other is in Texas.
Okay. And I have a related question here from Dustin Bleisefer. I'm trying to get to something that lets me know what your affiliation is, but this doesn't seem to let me do that. Sorry, Dustin. Dustin's asking, what's the opportunity for American companies to develop carbon capture storage technology and then market it overseas? Is this a area for industrial growth in the US?
Growth of the companies?
Yeah, so is this something that could become a product that's exported by the US, this technology?
I'm sure that the companies who are involved in it hope that the answer is yes, but it's uncertain whether in fact that will happen. Capturing from coal plants is different than capturing from other sources, in particular natural gas, because it's not as, I can't think of the word, there's less CO2 in the flue gas from a coal plant than from a natural gas plant. So it's more difficult. Natural gas plants also would capture pre-combustion rather than post-combustion. The problem for the coal industry overseas as well as domestically is that the price of renewables is going down so quickly that it's cheaper, and this is true for the US and overseas, it's cheaper to do renewables and not emit the CO2 that you're going to capture. I mean, producing and capturing CO2 is more expensive than not producing it in the first place and using renewables or energy efficiency.
So I'll ask you a leading question, but what about all of this infrastructure that we have sitting around that's ready and still able to produce? What about stranded assets?
Well, there will be some stranded assets, but as I talk about in my slides, and rather than try to go back to the slides, I apologize to folks. You look at my slide 6, you can see that the US coal industry is shrinking. Overseas, there's increasing competition to coal from renewables, and coal plants that are proposed to be built aren't being built, they're being canceled. So I don't think there's much of a market. I'm sure those who are taking federal money and doing these projects in the US now hope there's a market, but I don't see it.
So I'll try again somehow to be a devil's advocate here. So let's not think about this on the macro scale across the US or across the world. Let's think instead, I am a muni or I am a co-op and I own a coal plant, right? My motivations and the costs that will accrue to me are different than thinking about it on that macro scale. Is there any way in which this is a good idea for muni or co-op owners of coal plants?
Well, it depends on how much it costs to generate power, because the coal plants now have one product. They produce electricity. when you add carbon capture, they have two products. CO2, you think of them as a CO2 factory. They produce CO2 and electricity. So the question is, what's it going to cost to produce the CO2 versus what can you sell it for or else get a federal tax credit for? And what does it cost to produce the electricity and what can you sell the electricity for? The proponents of carbon capture talk about these coal plants are low-cost generators. And the few one of the problems is all of the owners of the coal plants that are now considering carbon capture haven't produced is the wrong word, haven't revealed what it costs them to generate electricity.
Right.
For
Just
one,
to return to one thing, I think that I asked you this and I'm not sure what the answer was. Is there actually a market for CO2 or one that would be something that this industry could tap into?
Well, it's used for enhanced oil recovery.
Yeah.
And in order to be profitable, you've got to have a high enough price for the CO2 you're selling if you're the coal plant owner. And you need companies willing to pay that high price. And that means you need a high oil price. Or else you can just produce oil the regular way, dig a hole, produce a well and just get the oil out. You don't need to go the extra mile and get the additional oil out.
And you also either need proximity to those oil wells or you need to include the cost of transporting the CO2.
Right, absolutely. Okay. And what's happened recently with the cratering of oil prices for a while, there's hard to see, there hasn't been very recently a real profitable market for CO2 for use in enhanced oil recovery. And if you look at the forward, the expected future prices of oil of $50 a barrel, doesn't look to us like it's going to be extremely profitable for an owner of a coal plant.
Yeah, I hear you.
They're not going to get $50 per ton of CO2 if the barrel of oil is only can be priced to the owner of the oil well at $50 a barrel.
Yeah. Let me take you in a different direction, but first I'm going to ask again, can those of you that are on the call, please write into the chat tab and just say hi so I can see you there. And if you have a question, to type it into the question tab, and I'll be glad to pass it along to David. So what I wanted to ask you, David, I was thinking about this while you were talking. What would you recommend to a utility commission or a state that was taking CCS under consideration? Are there criteria that they should consider? What should they look for and ask the developer for before approving something like this?
I think they should do renewables and energy efficiency. I would require the developers. Now, of the 7 or 8, depending on how you count them, projects being considered around the US, generally so far, the research and initial development is being funded by the federal government, by you and me and everybody, all the other US taxpayers. But for an investor-owned utility to do it, I'd require an integrated resource plan showing that this is the most economical and a lowest risk option for an investor-owned company. Especially if the plant is going to have to compete in a competitive wholesale market. The San Juan plant, last year its price of power, average cost of producing power was $44.90 a megawatt hour. The market prices averaged about 25. New solar power purchase agreements in the Southwest are on the average of $15 for straight solar and $30 for solar plus storage, meaning renewables are just a lot cheaper than going through the effort of retrofitting an existing coal plant.
Well, here's another leading question for you. What would you say to having an all-source RFP in advance to an IRP like that?
I think it's a wonderful idea.
Why don't you
I wish I thought of it.
Why would we do that?
Excuse me?
Why would we do that?
Well, for an investor, for any owner of a power, well, for an investor-owned utility, you do it so your customers get the lowest rates. And that's also true for co-ops or munis that own coal plants. Don't just, I mean, there's a myth that you need all this capacity that's dispatchable and that wind and solar in the wintertime don't produce as much power. So you need you need to keep these coal plants running. In reality, it's an integrated grid. So yes, you do need some dispatchable resource, but every company doesn't have to have a dispatchable coal plant. That's why you're part of a grid. So you look at economics and reliability and make a decision as what's the cheapest alternative. And
yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. Still hoping to see some other questions if people can write those in. And one other thing that I wanted to circle back to in your presentation, David, was the pattern you were talking about of projected to actual costs for large scale energy infrastructure. And I think that you give a few interesting examples of that. Can you talk about it as a pattern or something that you've seen over time and over many places in the US?
I'm in my 47th year of doing this work. I know I look a lot younger. For, let's see, 47 of those years, the pattern has been that the actual cost of building new technologies initially is more expensive, excuse me. And the theory is that over time, as you build more units, the cost goes down both because you're learning lessons from having built the previous unit or economies of scale, both in terms of building more units and the size of each unit. As I believe I mentioned in the presentation, the price of wind power and the price of solar power have declined dramatically over the last 9 or 10 years, because many gigawatts of solar and many gigawatts of wind have been produced. So far, 2 plants have been retrofitted for carbon capture. The various proposals that are outstanding to add carbon capture to existing coal plants assume dramatic decreases in the cost for them of retrofitting a plant. But each one assumes they're going to be the next plant or the one after that. So you're not talking about 23 gigawatts of plants being added. You're talking about for San Juan again, you're talking about a 72% decline or reduction in the cost of retrofitting a plant on a dollar per kilowatt basis in the very next plant. And the reality has been in the nuclear industry, in the utility industry with plants, the Edwardsport plant in Indiana and the Kemper plant in Mississippi, where the theory was you take coal and you make it into natural gas and then you burn the natural gas. The theory was that over time, new IGCC plants would be less expensive to build. And that hasn't been the truth. There's only been 2 of them because they're too expensive to build. I mean, I can't see anybody trying that route. And in the nuclear industry, there's been 3 or 4 renaissances of the nuclear industry promising that the new technology is not only going to be safer, it's going to be cheaper to build, it's going to be built a lot faster.
Mhm.
That's not been proven. Never, it has not come about. So if you're talking about doing a lot of units like the wind and solar, yes, you're going to get economies of scale. You're going to have a learning curve. And you probably will, with carbon capture over time, get some kind of a learning curve, but it's not guaranteed. And you don't know how quickly you're going to get the benefits in terms of reduced costs of retrofit.
Yeah. So, well, thank you, David. I think that we're out of questions online, and I think that we can pull this to a close. Is there anything that you'd like to leave us with, a takeaway?
If anyone has any more questions, contact me, or the slides will be on the IEEFA website, and
you can find David's email on the IEEFA website as well.
yes, just shoot the questions. We'll answer them.
Okay, thank you so much for doing this, David. This was really informative, and I appreciated it.
Okay, great. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.